Welcome to the Creating Flexibility in Your Talent Mobility Program webinar. We are proud to have worked with Caprello on this survey over the past few months. Collecting close to 200 responses, this webinar will touch on just a few of the findings and how they can be put into practice. This webcast has been pre-approved for an HRCI credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credit. You will receive an email from hr.com within 2 business days, which will include the certification credit information. You may also log into your hr.com account and view the credits you have received. If you have questions during the webcast, please click on the Q&A box in your webinar controls and type them in. Today we have Angela Tan, VP of Client Success Services at Caprello, moderating our group of key opinion leaders. Angela has not only been a valued member of the Caprello team for 10+ years, she is skilled at administering a diverse portfolio of corporate clients with emphasis on diversification, innovation, and equity and inclusion of policy and program. Joining Angela today, we are so fortunate to have our valued clients. Lee Motley is the Global Senior Talent Acquisition Manager at Wolfspeed Incorporated. With over 30 years of experience partnering with business leaders to develop talent acquisition strategies, Lee is an expert at identifying solutions that balance business goals with individual needs. His diverse HR background includes managing both talent acquisition teams and global mobility programs, and gives him the experience to develop strategies that attract and retain key talent in global industries. Also joining us is Michelle Williams, Global Mobility Manager at Walmart Canada. Michelle is a passionate leader that has been making waves in the global mobility industry for over 13 years, lending her expertise to the development and design of policies and processes. In every role, Michelle tirelessly drives change toward a more accepting, harmonized, and equitable world. Last but certainly not least, we have Kristen Inklin, Total Rewards Director at Fluke Corporation. Kristen is a licensed attorney and experienced HR professional with expertise in compensation, benefits, metrics, and analysis, to name a few. Having led confidential data management, employee engagement, and a large-scale Workday integration, Kristen brings a unique multidisciplinary background that drives her to make data-driven decisions while maintaining the flexibility to provide creative solutions. Let's get started. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kristen, Lee, and Michelle for joining for this important conversation today. And thank you all who are joining us online as well. We really appreciate the questions that you all provided when you registered. We did do our best to incorporate those into the session, so I think a lot of those will be addressed in conversation, but I'm certain the discussion will trigger additional questions. So please do be as interactive as possible. Drop those questions in the chat and we will add them in. All right, well, let's jump right into the survey data that we are reviewing today. When asked what changes in employee relocations regarding remote work and lifestyle are impacting mobility policies, 1/3, 33%, said relocation policies have been updated to better accommodate employee well-being and mental health. 35% said employees are now offered more personalized relocation benefits. And 43% said policies have been updated to accommodate flexible working arrangements. I think a lot of folks are making adjustments for flexibility, or at least having conversations about it. We're certainly leading it in our own client base. And really, it seems that for many companies, the pandemic essentially expedited those plans for greater flexibility within their workforce. So to get us started, I would love for the panel to walk us through the perspective from your own companies. What are the greatest challenges and changes you've had? And just to take it one step further, how have those impacted the way you're looking at your mobility policies? So Michelle, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Angela. I think the height of the pandemic has pushed us into obviously a way of working that we weren't used to, right? Sitting at these really uncertain times. And when you think about how you needed to make the shift in order to still have business running as usual, I think it called for, and I think we used this word beyond exhaustion last year and into this year, but pivoting so many different ways and looking at our policies, again, in our ways of working. Traditionally, we've always been in an office building type setting, right? Or we've been sending associates and employees off on assignments or moving them cross country. But what did that mean during the pandemic? And while things didn't slow down very much from a domestic perspective, and really from an international perspective, because, frontline being one of those essential services, there isn't really room to have a full stop. You still have to have that business running and still have to have your key players coming into the country and moving around the country. I think what we saw was just how do we then accommodate being able to bring them in, but not just bringing them in safely, making sure they're okay, making sure that everything is set up for them so that they can hit the ground running, but also making sure that whatever vaccinations needed to be done. If there was vaccines available at that time, which there weren't, but quarantine plans to come into the country. And it really took a lot of hands-on type of involvement in order for us to effectively be able to bring our workforce into and out of the country.
Hi, this is Lee. I'll just build on what Michelle was describing. The pandemic, obviously stating, obviously it caught everyone by surprise, but it hit us in a high growth moment for our company, which we're still in. And so I guess first, what I come at this from a recruiter's perspective. That's my functional area. And our mentality, as a recruiter, is we're going to land this candidate. We're not going to lose this candidate for all the other reasons that you don't want to lose candidates. Suddenly, we had to also consider what does mobility look like for this particular new hire. Part of this expansion is we're building a new factory in the U.S., but we're trying to pump lots of people into this new market. And so that was hard enough without the pandemic. So then you add that in, and it really, when you marry the mobility relocation aspects to the difficulties of recruiting anyway, and then the additional difficulties of recruiting during COVID, it really became and still is a very difficult time. So we have to be on our toes, and we have to be very creative about what we are considering, getting hiring managers and others on board with some new ideas.
I think our experience was a little bit unique as well. I think a lot of the same things, a lot of the same considerations were things Fluke was taking into account, like making sure employees are okay, making sure that we're providing appropriate packages. But in our case, leading up to the pandemic, we had a completely decentralized global mobility function. The way it worked is that HRBPs individually worked with business leaders to decide packages, and we didn't have standard works or standard processes. So as much as it might sound a little odd to say, the pandemic presented an opportunity because it slowed down the pace of travel so much that we only had 1 or 2 assignments in flight, and that allowed us to stop focusing on individual employees and individual situations where there might have been 5 or 6 before the pandemic, and instead pivot and build our standard works, build our process, centralize our function. So it was sort of a unique experience, but it definitely allowed us to put something in place that hadn't been there before.
I love the magic language. It's not an issue, right? It's an opportunity. It's not a challenge, it's an opportunity. So going into the next data piece, every company is experiencing change right now in one capacity or another. And one of the most impactful, obviously, and Lee sort of touched on this, is employee expectation in this crazy job market that we're all managing within. And one of those big expectations is place of work. So the study found that 54% of employees are asking to work remotely at a high or very high degree, and that 25% of employees are simply refusing to relocate at all. And I read another stat in a Business Insider survey that said nearly 40% of workers would consider quitting, so actually leaving their jobs, if their bosses made them return to work full-time in the office. So given that changing landscape, I'm wondering, will you be, or have you already added a remote worker or virtual assignment policy? And then on the flip side, have you made any changes to ensure compliance with the work from anywhere, especially as it relates to components like tax and immigration? So Lee, your thoughts?
Yeah, sure, Angela. Well, as I mentioned, I come at this from the recruiting angle, but we also have our HR partner and all of our hiring departments that are involved in it. It working remotely wasn't a strategy. We didn't have remote workers before, and perhaps a lot of other companies were in the same situation. And to my knowledge, it was on no one's radar to even consider a remote working policy. Um, we have a number of locations around the U.S. and globally where people generally would move to. So obviously we had to rethink that, and there was a period of a couple of months back early 2020 when everything shut down. We have manufacturing components as well, which didn't shut down, so it created an interesting dynamic within the company that part of the company is operating sort of business as usual, albeit with masks and temperature screening stations and whatnot. But everyone else was sheltering in place. We were still recruiting during that period. But what happened is we quickly realized that we were still able to perform effectively remotely, and executive management leadership recognized this and even celebrated it and communicated it openly in weekly video chats from the CEO about how well we're doing. And as a result, we have come forward with a long-term remote working policy, independent of COVID. This will continue beyond COVID, whenever that is. And so it's really forced us out of the box very quickly. I'm really proud at how quickly the company, came around with the idea, the strategy, and what it means and how to implement it. We actually even created a tagline for it. It's called "Work Where It Works." WWIW, and you'll see that mentioned in emails, but it's part of our philosophy now. And when we put out company notifications related to remote working, that tagline is now used. It's like a marketing phrase. So maybe we need t-shirts or something, but it's been a really quick turnaround, but it's really going well. Now, long term, we've got to get past COVID. And then what does that overall strategy look like? To be determined, I think.
That's very similar to our experience as well. Fluke has a really strong on-site culture, a lot of in-person kaizens and events that we tended to do. And so I think the initial assumption was that working remotely wouldn't succeed. And then as the pandemic hit and we were forced into that situation, we found that the teams could be just as productive. One of the things that caused us to have to look at is that our initial set of standard works for our mobility policies assumed that all assignments would be business driven, that we would have a business need and we would tap someone on the shoulder and we would say, hey, we want you to move to Germany for 3 years. So we're going to put you on an expat assignment and here's all the things that you'll get. But what started happening is that employees would raise their hand and say, I don't want to work in California anymore. I don't want to work in the US anymore. I want to go live in England. And we found ways to support that with our policies. So one of the things we did was create what we called a parking lot policy, which is essentially when there's an employee-driven or immigration-driven move that is not supported by a business need, we opened up the door to having, I would almost call it a bare bones policy. I hate to say it that way, but it was to allow employees the flexibility when normally what the business would say, we can't let you do that. It costs too much to put you on an assignment. Instead, what we said is, we're going to just make life a little easier for you. We're going to provide access to the resources you need, some of the basics to get you from point A to point B. And then because you're telling us that you want to move, you're going to be on your own to figure the rest of it out. But before we had the policies and before we were partnering with Caprilo, we didn't have the language to figure that out or any of the resources that we needed to put that in place. So that was a really unique thing I think that we did where basically we allow employees the flexibility to move and the access to the resources to do it, even if we're not funding all parts of the assignment when they're the ones saying that they want to do it.
Yeah, I think I'll echo both what Lee and Kristen said. I think we were forced again into a situation where we had to think outside of the norm and we were working from home, but we did prove that even though we were working from home and not in a traditional setting, we could still produce, we could still support the stores and the DCs from, a home environment, sometimes maybe over supporting to the point where, you don't know when your end times are, but nonetheless, we were producing, and leadership was very, very good in recognizing that we were showing resiliency. We were there to support the stores and the DCs. I think what this also kind of showed us was that, and I'm going to put this in the context of where I'm probably going to age myself, but the Jetsons, like we're just now propelling ourselves into the Jetsons age where, if I can work from Canada in my home office and still hold a productive meeting with someone in Asia and still, coordinate time zones and all that good stuff, there should be no reason why we couldn't, open up our policies to say, okay, why can't we have remote ways of working and different ways of working? I think once a company, and I think honestly, if employers don't start looking at different ways of working, you are going to definitely to the point of 25% more employees are refusing to relocate. I think if we're not looking at different ways of working for our population, we are going to lose key talent, and they are going to go to companies that are going to be willing to be more flexible with their policies and allow them to work anywhere in the world. So I think it's something that we all need to keep on the top of our radar for sure.
That's great. And Jetsons doesn't age you. Jetsons is still current in my opinion. So I'm curious though, because speaking to spaces where you can do something hybrid, you can work remotely. Those are specific to certain positions, and certainly that's expanded significantly over the last year or so with most companies. But there are still positions where they cannot be remote, where they are required to be on site, and each of you have positions like that. And I'm curious if you've leaned into mobility benefits to incentivize or ease the requirements of relocating for those folks where you cannot offer a hybrid solution or a hybrid incentive to those individuals.
I know in our case, it changed the conversation a lot. Before COVID, the way that the conversation went with candidates was, hey, we're offering you this position and we're going to help you with relocation. Isn't that great? Isn't that a great benefit we're providing? And partly because of the nature of that conversation, the benefit could be sort of very standard market benefit. Employees still often appreciated it because it made the stress of moving from one location to another less. After COVID, it really shifted to where, hey, we're asking you a favor by asking you to relocate. It's us trying to ask you to do more than what you necessarily need to do for the job or that you might see needing to do for the job. And so we need to make sure our benefit is really good. Because it's not just here's this extra thing we're giving you, it's we need to show you that it's worth it to relocate, or we'll have people say no. So it definitely shifted the tone of the conversations.
For us, I'm going to say that it kind of just made us realize that we had to kind of just be quick on our feet. So it wasn't necessarily about changing the benefits at that particular point in time, but how to be more flexible with those benefits. For instance, moving that person from cross country when they had to quarantine for 14 days. Well, what does that look like from a temporary housing perspective? Because quarantining and with 14 days of quarantine, you can't get out and go look for a permanent home, right? So how does that then extend into that temporary housing benefit and allowing that threshold for where the associate can quarantine safely, be safe, but then have that opportunity to still look for a home without having to press on crunch time and be stressed out that they only have a minimum amount of days left in temp housing before they find that permanent home. So I think it was more, again, I'm going to use the word pivoting to just say, what are we doing with our current benefits so that we can be more flexible and agile and allow the employee the opportune time to be able to do what they need to do to land on their feet in destination.
And I'll just add on to what Michelle was getting at. I mentioned we've been opening and are in the process of building a new factory, and this is a high volume time for us. What we experienced, and I don't laugh because it's funny, but because it's unusual, and we became counselors in ways for anxiety, right? I mean, a lot of people were preparing to take a new job. That's hard enough. They're preparing to relocate. That's hard enough. And then add to that all the restrictions and the quarantining, in particular, not to pick on any particular state, but our expansion is happening in New York, and New York State had some pretty more strict requirements coming and going, perhaps in other states. And it really created some stressful moments for the new hires who were transferring in or planning to transfer in, but also we had a number of existing employees who went from headquarters to the new location for several months. And they were already in place and COVID hit. And now they're sort of stuck, and their travels back and forth to see their family were impacted. So it really created a lot of stress on everyone involved. And I'm probably, stating the obvious there, but we really had to scramble and think case by case, what will work for this person. And so I think you hear the word flexibility being used by all of us, and that is clearly maybe the key word during this time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Each of you touched on it in a different way, because Kristen spoke to flexibility and benefits. Michelle spoke to flexibility of usage, and you almost spoke to flexibility of delivery of the benefits, which is interesting as well. So, so thank you all for that. So switching gears a bit to our next finding, we're going to focus on how relocations are actually being used. You have a mobility program, obviously, but the question is, what are the needs that are driving the usage of those benefits? So survey respondents said that long-term or permanent relocations are most often used to fill positions that have a specialized skill set, 61%, are filling a necessary leadership role, 54%, and more than half also say they use long-term assignments when they have difficulty finding local candidates with the needed expertise and experience, which is increasingly the case in this competitive job market. Only 31% say they use relocation to support employee circumstances, but at nearly a third, that's still a pretty significant figure for reasons for relocation. So given that information, I'm wondering how you all are using assignments and how that's changing or flexing. Lee?
Yeah, that's a great question, Angela. It's interesting, again, because of this growth that we're experiencing, we have found ourselves in need of certain skill sets in a new location, and not necessarily in the new factory location, but in other of our locations, but not on a permanent basis. Maybe more of a go there for a few months to like an IT or finance professional to be on site in the location to help them come up to speed. And so one of the things we changed, what we had to create, frankly, was a short-term assignment, domestic US, that we didn't really have before. And so we had to quickly come out of the box. I mean, it was literally a call from one of the HR business partners. Hey, we have this person we need to send there. Do we have a policy? No, unfortunately we don't. How soon do you need it? And so we had to work very quickly to put something in place. So it started off being driven as a business need to have a skill set in a location, but we quickly, realized that this isn't going to change in the future. These are activities that we probably will continue doing. So let's think about this not just in a we need a short-term business fix, but in a more long-term strategy. And we started thinking about that as also a development opportunity. So now we can sell it both as or we have plans to sell it as both a business need, but also development opportunity for you. But because of that, we tailored and modified what we originally drafted as a business-driven assignment, short-term assignment. We went back and edited it and then tailored it, adding a few more, how would I say, allowances perhaps, so that the assignment would be enticing to the individual. because it's a need that we have, but we also want the individual to see it as a development opportunity, but also see it as an attractive proposition. Because of COVID, and maybe the location wouldn't be as desirable as we would want it to be, or whatever the case might be. So we really found ourselves thinking about it in two ways. What do we need from a business perspective? How do we entice people to raise their hand and say, hey, I would like to take that opportunity? And we now have something in place that we're not quite using yet, but we worked quickly to put it there.
That is so incredibly similar to our experience as well. I think in the past, prior to COVID, the conversation was really, where is the business gap? Okay, let's tap someone on the shoulder. Let's send them to go fill the business gap. Let's do it in a way that's cost effective for the business. And so we had more moves, and we tended to have a what I would call less market competitive package that we offered people. Of course, we didn't realize that because it was decentralized, but we tended to try and put more people on site when we could. What we're finding now is that there's so much more of a need to develop strong talent, but our day-to-day business, our ability to connect, our ability to get things done doesn't require people to be on site as much as we thought. And so this conversation of tap, we need you to go live in another country for 3 years and it just has to happen or else the business won't succeed is not really what we're having anymore. It's more, we think you as an employee and you as a leader will grow if you get to experience this team. And so very similar to Lee, what we found is our policies have to be enticing for people because we're asking them, not telling them. And so it's a much better conversation, but it's a real shift in tone and a real shift in focus.
Yeah, I'm going to say I'm on par with Lee and Kristen, because that's the same thing. Before the pandemic, the gears were already turning with regards to, having variety throughout the program. And I was working with Caprilo to start devising a short-term domestic assignment policy. And lo and behold, the pandemic hits, and then we've got a need to start shifting talent and moving them around very quickly. So we piloted the short-term assignment policy and had market leaders moving across the country almost instantaneously. And it proved to really help fill that gap from a talent need perspective, especially in remote areas, right? And during the pandemic, even more so. But I think what really helped drive that pilot to what I would like to think would be successful is the fact that there was the opportunity to say, we don't need you here permanently, but we do need your skill set here for a short period of time, at which time then we'll just return you back to your other market, your originating market, and then you can just resume life as is. In the interim, no one's life in the home, in the origin city has to change. The family's life doesn't need to change because we really just need that talent, even if it's from a succession planning perspective, just need that talent right here for this instance. And then we just send them right back to where they belong. So I think there was a lot of opportunities to see how we could, be flexible, agile in our policies and the creation of policies throughout the pandemic, for sure.
I'm hearing a lot of elements of opportunity as we speak to flexibility. And I think that's interesting and noteworthy that the two actually very much go hand in hand in a lot of discussions and adjustments that you all are making. So that's great. So that dovetails to our next finding regarding the way that on a broader scale, relocation is viewed within the company. So we've kind of talked about usage, but how is it viewed? What's typically driving the request for a relocation or an assignment, and how is that relocation managed? So we pulled out a highlight of some of those stats from the survey. 60% responded that relocation is encouraged within their companies. 48% advised that they're supporting relocations initiated by employees, although 84% said relocation is still primarily initiated by the employer. And 68% view relocation as a positive opportunity, but only 44% treat relocation as a standard benefit for qualified employees. So to our esteemed panel, I'm wondering, how are your hiring managers and transferees or assignees viewing the relocation opportunities? Are your employees being sort of pulled into the assignments? Are they raising their hand and you're seeing more of the employee initiated situation? I think Kristen sort of touched on some of this already. And how are the hiring managers adjusting who they're willing to relocate? Lee, you want to jump in there?
Sure thing. Well, yeah, I don't know if employees are raising their hand, so to speak, to go to another location. I guess you could find an example or two where that's been the case. But again, because of our growth, and we're a highly specialized and a highly technical industry and company, if you want to be in our industry, and particularly you want to work on the technology that we work on, you kind of have to follow the job. So that's not to the advantage of the employee in many cases, if we're talking about internals. So many are, understanding. Now I'm not on the runway where those discussions are happening with the employee and the manager about your job is now needed in this new location. So I don't know how those are being delivered. But generally speaking, when I do interact with the employees, they seem to be okay with it. I guess I'll leave it at that, or at least accepting that I have to go to this location to continue, developing my particular skill set, and in some cases, highly specialized skill set. But again, with that, we're talking about, I as a recruiter and any of the audience that experience, the term war for talent is a real, it's kind of a cliche, but it's real. And so you have to, and again, I'm coming at this from a recruiter's angle. We have to consider those things. And so we generally don't let relocation get in the way of hiring that really highly skilled person. We do try to manage it. We don't just open up the box and say anything you want, we'll take. In fact, my approach is to try to always go back to the baseline policy, start from there, no matter what the circumstance is that the individual has, and then work your way up or out or into a modified, because if you're not careful, you'll quickly have, 100 employees with 100 different packages and 100 different policies. So I hope that's answering the question, but we've had to really remain creative. Those who are interested in moving, it's easier. Some have moved before, they get how it works. They're sometimes less needy, fewer requests. And in other cases, it is a really flipping my life upside down. And I've never experienced this before in my family, and we're all freaking out. What do we do? And so we really have to be careful about those.
I think for me, this slide still speaks true, because I still think we're in this state, but I also think it's dependent on when you're talking about how relocations are viewed, right? So if you were talking about in the height of the pandemic, I would say most definitely you would have seen a lot of resistance coming from employees saying, whoa, no, I don't know. I don't even feel safe in my own city, let alone moving somewhere else. But now I think that now, we're getting into almost 2 years in of pandemic mode. And I think that is starting to ease a little bit. What I would say is that, what I do see is probably going to be a shift. To Lee's point about the war on talent, I think we are going to see that shift where it is going to be, relocations are going to be viewed where we were trying to align mobility with talent acquisition before in the past. I think it's really going to come to fruition now in the future. So we will see that shift where it will really become that talent acquisition tool, and it will become that value to not just the talent acquisition team, but to that relocating employee as well.
Absolutely. Completely agree with both Michelle and Lee on this. I think in particular, the thing that we've noticed is that the questions that we're asking have shifted during the pandemic. So one of the things that happened before, as I mentioned, is that we had a higher volume of assignments, and it was so much more about just, we need to get this person from here to here. And now what we have is a lot more of, why is the assignment happening? And that helps guide the conversation a lot. Still very strongly initiated by the employer for the most part. We tend to be the ones that say, hey, we want to send someone on the assignment, but when we know that the why behind the assignment is significant, it allows us to have a more robust conversation about what's included and whether it's okay to go outside of the standard package, whether there's a need to provide an additional benefit to employee or a different benefit to the employee than what's in our standard package. So that's been a really interesting shift as well.
Yeah, that's great. We did have a question come in. And folks want to know if any attendees seen a rise in employee-initiated relocation requests at your organization. So, Kristen, I don't know if you want to keep going and answer that one quick.
Yeah, we did see a slight increase. There are definitely a handful of employees. I'd say less than a dozen. We're about a 3,300 person company globally, so we wouldn't expect to have a huge number, but I'd say about somewhere between 7 to 10 employees who said, you know, look, I have family on the other side of the country and I'd rather live there, or I have always wanted to live in another country and this is my opportunity. And, you know, most of my team is in Europe, so it aligns the time zones better. And those are the cases where we've used our parking lot policy to say, you know, we'll give you the resource to know who to call. We'll help you with some of the basics, and we'll support the fact that you want to do this. We'll be supportive of it. But other than that, it's your move that you're making, and what our policy does is just gives you access to things that you might not know how to find them on your own without our assistance.
I'll take that one next, if it's okay. We haven't really seen a lot of employee-initiated relocations. There have been a few who've decided, because COVID forced us to rethink our remote work strategy, right? The dominoes start to fall. Hey, if I can be remote, I've always wanted to live in this city or this part of the world, or go back home, or whatever that means. And there have been a few employees that I have seen, but they didn't ask for relocation. I just discovered that they were now working out of a new location. However, I think time will tell on what that looks like longer term as that trend starts to grow. Again, we're talking about a very small window of time where we've even been thinking about these things, right? Since March 2020, all this began. And it's really a small sample if you think about you know, how long that's been to change policies, to change thinking, to change strategy. So time will tell, is my point, how that trend continues, whether more employees, because we now have a remote-based working philosophy when possible, how many employees may start to ask for company-sponsored relocation benefits to get to some location that is beneficial to me, but also beneficial to the company in some way. We really haven't seen much yet, but I feel like that may be a building trend.
Yeah, agreed. I think for us, there wasn't a lot of employee initiated moves. But again, I think it was just, you know, the state of the world in which that dictated that. I do agree that we are probably going to see a shift as people start to get into different ways of working, one, and then the war on talent continues to increase. I think we will start to see a shift in that. But right now, yeah, there was probably very minimal employee initiated moves over the last year and a half.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting because I think when all of this started and we started moving into that work from anywhere space and work from home space, there was a feeling of, you know, how many folks are going to want to move at this point, and where are they all going to go? And we have, and maybe that pipeline is building at this time, but it still sort of comes back to that flexibility space. Are you positioning yourself so that if and when it does come, or the next item comes, are you ready for that? So touching into the next data point, we've talked about flexing policies, benefits, we've talked about their application, but that leads to how you're managing it and where you're managing it internally. So our survey showed that more than half of the respondents house mobility under general HR. 34% of the companies do not have a dedicated global mobility budget. 35% advise that their corporate HR oversees their mobility budget. And that leaves 31% with mobility budgets managed by regional HR, hiring managers, or individual business units. So obviously flexibility is our topic today, but to ring fence that idea, how do you balance the controls to allow flexibility and still maintain compliance, manage consistency concerns, support the business unit needs, and also protect the employees who don't necessarily know what they don't know. So who's involved in that conversation and decision making? And further to that, how are you managing Relo internally? And where does the mobility budget lie within your own organization? So a lot to unpack there. Michelle, do you want to take a jump in first?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's so much to unpack there, because I think when you're looking at costs, I think overall as mobility, we still have a duty and obligation to provide the businesses with oversight on what those potential costs look like when it comes to employee movement, right? But outside of that, I think in managing those costs, it's a combination of looking at it yourself from a mobility perspective, but also working with your RMC. I mean, your RMC is literally your fiscal gatekeeper, right? And they have eyes on the prize. They know exactly what transactions are going through, and they ultimately have to bring awareness to you about what potential costs may go over the budget that may have been initially stated to the business. So I think you really have to partner with your RMC very closely to make sure that costs are being monitored. That being said, I think from just a state of the world in the pandemic, understanding that you have to let the businesses know that there has to be some flexibility when it comes to costs, because there are going to be costs that are out of our control. Even again, going back to the quarantine example, there's not going to be every cost that we can initially control. And even outside of the pandemic, there were costs that we couldn't control depending on individuals and their circumstances. But I think just embedding that flexibility into the business's mindset will allow you to effectively be able to manage and cost contain.
We had, I think, a somewhat unique experience, because one of the things that was the case for Fluke is that with a decentralized global mobility program, the budget was also decentralized. And so it tends to be human nature. People love spending other people's money and hate spending their own. So with the budget held within the different parts of the business, what we found is that the businesses were always sort of pushing for a cheaper assignment, cutting things out, trying to get the most cost-effective assignment that they could. And so creating some structure, having standard policies, having an assignment package where we said, this is what we include in an assignment, really helped us provide the structure that we needed to the conversation, so that when we tell the business, here's what the cost estimate is, instead of coming back and saying, how can we get that lower? They understood that every part of that cost estimate was a specific market standard, vetted, consistent benefit that anyone going on assignment gets. And that the reality is sending people, especially on international assignments, is not a cheap prospect. So it has to be an assignment that's worth sending the person on. It has to be worth the cost to the business. And having structure sort of counterintuitively provided us some flexibility, because instead of every conversation being about what can we cut out, we started the conversation now with, here's the standard package. What does the employee need? If the employee genuinely doesn't need something, they won't use it. And even though it's in the estimate, you won't have to pay for it. So don't worry about that. And when employees need more, the business has a better view into what is standard, so they can see that maybe the employee only needs a little bit more and not feel like it's a huge ask. So we found that having a really good structure in place for assignments allowed us to sort of counteract that mentality of let's save as much money as possible that comes from having the budget held out within the business instead of in a general HR bucket.
Kristen, that's the interesting path that you've followed, because it mirrors in many ways some of what I've seen. In our past, we had relocation budgets that belonged squarely in the department, and each department, not each department, but each division, has a finance leader, and so that person had a lot of eyes on these kinds of things, which they should. That's normal, not unreasonable. However, the trouble began when this and I'm not picking on any finance team members by any means, but when they were approving or a part of an approval chain, more as an awareness on a job offer, and they would see some of the relocation estimates in this offer, some got really sideways with that and was started picking, and this is from the finance person, not even the hiring manager. So my point in telling that story is that we had people attempting to make decisions on what was reasonable for relocation and making the relocation portion of the job offer more a la carte at their driven by their own thinking. And it was ignorance, right? They didn't understand relocation. They just felt that this number can't be right. This is an egregious number. How dare the vendor charge us this amount? That can't be the going rate. And it created conversations that were unnecessary. And so ultimately what happened is the relocation dollars budgets got moved into sort of generic HR bucket. We started budgeting for it. It gets reallocated. But it removed that visibility. Normally, visibility and transparency is very good. I'm not advocating against it, but in this case, it smoothed it out. And then we have slowly been sort of bringing decisions for relocation back into a more centralized starting point. Hiring managers, it's funny because there's two types of hiring managers: those who are budget conscious and are willing to hear discussions about, let's not do that, but do you have other options? And then those that are only concerned about that particular skill set. I need them, and I need them to start tomorrow. Whatever it takes, I don't care. Don't ask me, just make it happen. So we have to balance those things, but it's interesting journey that we've been through on where the dollars used to sit versus where they sit today. I own that gatekeeping process. And I mentioned earlier that one of the things that I am very consistent about, along with my CapRelo support, is creating a good baseline policy and then starting there every time. And then so we're able to justify exceptions to that policy based on unique circumstances, rather than it be the Wild West decision-making process. I hope that addressed the question.
Yeah, that was great. All three of you, I appreciate it. I have a client, but it's been a few years since they made this change, and their exception rate was over 20%. And they they own the relocation budget within HR, and they moved the exception component out to the business units, and sort of ties into what Kristen was saying. You find you're a lot less generous when you have cost. We're always willing to give the moon and the stars when we know that we're not going to be paying for it. So their acceptance rate decreased to 2%. So the point being, there's a whole lot of different solutions out there, and if there's opportunity there amongst your stakeholders to maybe adjust how that's structured so that it feels right and runs better, that's a conversation worth having. So that leads us to the question: where are human resources and global mobility departments finding the greatest opportunities for growth and development post-pandemic? So one of the findings showed that fewer than 2/3, so only 62% of respondents report their organizations have a comprehensive mobility policy. And surprisingly, it's just over half that feel their employees are either highly satisfied overall or highly satisfied with the level of support provided by their relocation policies and processes. So it does feel like for some companies, there's maybe more opportunity to be had. I'm wondering what some of the key items are, even if you could just give one piece of advice to someone who's thinking, my policy could use some help. Where should I start? So, Michelle?
Yeah, so this for me is three points. So one is a shift from, I shouldn't say a shift, but really when we're talking about flexibility, looking at equitability as well, right? So taking away not just from, and I wouldn't say from front facing, it doesn't have to appear to be taking away, but creating a line of equity amongst your employees and who you're relocating. I think we need to take a shift of looking at who the employee is, instead of looking at that, taking a look at where the employee is in their life, right? Because my needs are not going to be the same as Kristen's needs, the same as Lee's needs. So shifting that mindset to say, you know, what are we doing for this person who may be president, CEO versus this person who is manager level, to say, okay, what does president, CEO need, and where is he at or she at in her life, their lives, versus where is the manager at their lives to accommodate, you know, a policy that's going to fit those needs and help them to acclimate wherever they're going sooner rather than later. And then I think the other piece of that for me would be from a perspective of, you know, employee empowerment. I think we focus so much on the employee experience, and I think that stat really proves that. But we're looking at employee experience and satisfaction, but what are we really doing to empower our employees, right? How are we empowering them to take on new assignments, take on moves? And I think that's where you'll see the satisfaction rate grow, because as we play into that key theme, you're going to see that satisfaction level grow, because the employee's looking at it from an aspect of, my employer is investing in me. They're not just investing in me from a growth perspective, but they're investing in me from empowering me to say that I do want to take this assignment on, or I do want to move here. But it's not according to just whatever, you know, baseline benefits are available. They're actually taking into consideration my personal circumstances and looking at it from not just the cost containment lens, but what do they need to provide for me, and what do I need to provide for myself in order to make this an effective assignment / move. So I think those are the two lenses that I would say that we need to look at.
Yeah, Michelle, I agree. I guess if I were given a piece of advice, it would be similar in terms of your whole employee population is not homogeneous, right? There's a lot of differences. And so we used our relocation partners to help us benchmark the different types of demographics. We have four. We have, you know, an executive, a professional, a sort of technician level, and then new grad, because they have different needs. And so I would encourage looking at it from that perspective, if that mirrors your demographic, for those in the audience, if you can segregate them in ways like that, because of their needs are very different. We may offer the, you know, white glove treatment for one, whereas a new grad has maybe half an apartment full of stuff that can go into a U-Haul truck. I mean, literally that is often the case. And so but it helps with some cost containment, because, you know, if you offer the same package to everyone, you end up spending more on some than you really need to, or you create many exceptions for the one on the higher end who is experiencing a package that didn't offer all the things that they needed. So it's really helped us sort of know where to begin on an individual, and then we make exceptions within that package based on circumstances that make sense.
I completely agree. And I think the other thing I would say, and this may apply more to global policies specifically than domestic, but there are very few things that sort of are 100% core, should apply to absolutely everybody. And so the flexibility that Lee and Michelle talked about is really key. But in global policies in particular, one of the things that we found is that the business and often employees, if it was their first assignment, might not realize just how important certain aspects of the policy are to them and how much they benefit them. And the best example I can think of is tax equalization. When someone moves from one country to another, it is expensive on paper. It doesn't, you know, most people don't want to think about taxes. And so you see the word tax and you're like, I just want to deal with this later. And so to have something called tax equalization in a policy may feel like maybe it doesn't need to be core, because people just don't really understand what it's doing. But it is so key. Every time anyone at any level moves from one country to another, they're going to have a tax burden in both countries. And so that is a benefit that should never be an exception, never not be core, in my personal opinion. And I think when we talk about growth opportunities, there's adding as much flexibility as possible so that you can really tailor plans to different people and not have things seem like exceptions that aren't. But there's also this opportunity of making sure that employees and the business And us as global mobility professionals look at that sort of small subset of things and say, these are the things that simply must be offered because it will harm the employee financially if we don't offer them. And so we have that sort of strength of core policy to support the greater flexibility that we offer in other spaces.
Thank you. So we're nearing our time, but I did want to do a quick round robin with you all, and just kind of look to future state for a moment. So 2021 is nearing its end. It's been a wild year, and 2022 is right on the horizon. So if you could just kind of lean into what we know, what we've learned a lot in the last couple of years. Where do you see the roadmap going for 2022 and beyond for you all? And then if you could, I can maybe just your New Year's resolution for the year so we can end on a high note. Lee, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. Well, we're maintaining what we have for the foreseeable future, but I do wonder what's coming with. Again, we have a lot of now remote-based and growing remote-based, permanently remote-based employees, but we have a lot of other employees who are intended to relocate. And I think I may have mentioned this earlier, is what happens when COVID is over, if that even is such a thing. And we then ask these people, okay, now it's time. What will happen, right? Will they be still willing to relocate, or will the buzz have worn off and they've figured out and they start negotiating to stay in place? That could impact the business. That could impact operations or whatever the department they belong to. So that'll be an interesting change or potential change coming up. Otherwise, we don't have any plans at this point to change our policies, but you never know what's around the corner. New Year's resolution, I'll be quick. I was thinking about this recently. Look, I don't commute to work anymore. I mean, I commute down the steps. And so if I could say, if I get that, 30 minutes on the front end and 30 minutes on the back end back, I look back and I realize that that was my time to do whatever, to decompress or decompose or whatever the right word is, depending on how the day went. How can I use that time still for me, rather than just bleed into my work and it never really ends, right? So how can I bookend in ways and maybe take advantage of an extra hour? I don't know. We'll see.
Go ahead, no, go ahead, Kristen. I saw you. Go ahead.
I saw us pop off mute at the same time. I'll say we're in a similar place to Lee in terms of our policies. In our case, we just put them in 2020. We built them in 2020, sort of launched them at the beginning of 2021. So they're sort of new and shiny at this point. I don't think we have major changes coming, and we tried to build in as much flexibility as possible because we knew COVID is, at least hopefully, a sort of unique point in time. And so if you build policies that respond to COVID, you're not going to have the longevity that you would need. So I'm hoping that we see that as we come out of COVID, these policies continue to support us as well as they have so far. And if not, we'll continue working with the CAP Reload team to refine them and build in more flexibility. So I think that's our plan going forward. For New Year's resolution, mine is also fairly quick. I think the thing that I am resolving to do the most is just spend a little bit more time with my hobbies. I have a 3-year-old turning 4 in January. And I think most people know 0 to 3 is the time when parents don't get to have hobbies. They get to have a toddler, and that is your hobby. So he's getting to an age where he has his own interests, and that might allow me to pick up my quilts and my paints and do a little bit more creative stuff next year. So that's my plan.
So for us, I think what we're looking at for the new year is just innovating the program a little bit more and leveraging other programs that we could use to marry into mobility, fill talent shortage gaps, all of that good stuff. So that's what I see coming probably for 2022. And then obviously looking at different ways of working, continuing to build off of that. What does that look like in the future to point, post-pandemic? What is the future way of working going to look like? Or are we still going to want to be in the setting? Are we still going to want to leverage talent from a remote perspective? So looking at that big overall lens, probably what 2022 holds really strong for us. Personal for me, resolution is, I think this year, what I've liked to say that I pride myself on is finding my voice and trying to be my most authentic self. So next year, my resolution is going to be to continue to find my voice, speak my truth, and be my most authentic self and bring my most authentic self to work every day.
I think I'll just use all three of your resolutions as mine, and that should carry me through a successful 22. On behalf of Caprillo and HR.com, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Kristen. Your insights have been terrific. I think they really resonate with a lot of people right now, and they can relate to all of those pieces that you're speaking to in some way or another. And with that, I will throw it back to Mackenzie.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. This concludes our webcast today. I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us. If you joined late and would like to view this webcast again, the recording will be available on hr.com in our archived webcasts. Your HRCI credit will show up in your hr.com account within 2 business days. We will also send out an email with the credit information. Please take a few moments to fill out the webcast survey that will open on your screen. Your feedback is very important to us. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.